Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for spending some time with us. I believe we've got about an hour to go through this. I am going to move kind of quick to cover the topics that Dave Bell asked me to cover, but in any time, if anybody has a question, do not mind you bouncing in and firing that question off, because more important than anything, we want you to walk away from this finding the time well spent. So what we're going to start out with talking about is just the firmware and some basic connection tools. I'm going to kind of go through those procedures. I set together a PowerPoint earlier in the week to help with this and help speed things up. But in prelude of going into that, we're going to just bounce through real quick some of the hardware. So another thing, too, before we get into the hardware is we have been working quite a lot on a lot of extensive projects. These are a couple of screenshots from a couple of projects that I've recently been involved in where we're doing absolute full automation, meaning once they put the unit into run mode, unless it has a direct fault that shuts the unit down, the unit can shut down and go into a standby, but actually restart itself at a later time. Totally unmanned situations. And so I thought it was kind of, I've been doing a lot of work with those projects, and so I wanted to include a couple of those screenshots from some of these projects in here. Just to let you know how custom we can set up the HMIs and the arrangements of the HMIs. So let's just do a quick review of the hardware. We have a DE4000 HMI display. Some more additional options are coming, but this is the classic 8-inch that we've had from the very beginning. It has some hard keys across the bottom, as well as several soft keys in it. We have our main control board that houses the SOM module and the main computer. Also, for future reference later in this video, right there at the end of the SOM module, we'll see a little bit of a notch out. That is a place for updating, doing several updates, firmware being one of them for today's topic, where you could link this thing with a micro SD card, as well as we have the Wi-Fi antenna connection for Wi-Fi connectivity. So, and then we have additional ports for connecting to a PC, and as well as 5 additional ports for 5 terminal boards. And keep in mind, when we connect with a Wi-Fi or a laptop, you have the same exact connectivity and interaction with the system as you do through the HMI. So a little bit closer look at the control board. Again, we have the slot for the micro SD card. Port 6, relatively, if we're using the classic 8-inch HMI, is dedicated for that. Our port 7 is an external port for connecting a laptop to. We're going to get into that here in a moment or two. And then we have our 5 ports for connectivity to other terminal module boards, which is where our channels are. We have our power connections. We have our DS connections, which are some of the most important connections for controlling, say, fuel valve, ignition, driven equipment ready signals, start signals to OEM, smart engines, et cetera, et cetera. And we have our connectivity back to, these come in from our hardwire switch, our hard switches on the bottom of the HMI that I pointed out a moment ago. Terminal board. Terminal board's very similar function to the DE3000 if you're familiar with that product. We still have dip switches. We have channels 1 through 32, so an additional 2 channels. Each channel can be configured as anything under the sun that we want in connectivity with the use of the software as well as the dip switches. The only difference is the dip switches have gotten a little smaller. We also have a board ID label or dial available. Numbers 0 through 9 are displayed on it. So if we have a 1-terminal board system, the arrow would point to terminal 1. If we have a 2-board system, our secondary board, the arrow would point to 2, so on and so forth. 4 analog outputs, digital outputs, rather than being syncing only to ground, like a DE3000 or legacy DE product, the 4000 can be syncing or sourcing. So we actually provide an input reference voltage or ground. They are polarity sensitive. They do have built-in 2-amp fuse protection to them. And then, of course, the Ethernet connectivity to go back to the control board. Okay, so we're going to talk about firmware first. And this is something that's very, very important that I want to explain and want everybody to understand. What you'll see in the background is a snapshot that I took actually off my computer. As Dave Bell mentioned, I have been doing a lot of, I guess we could say, research and development or testing and field trials with the system as the engineers are producing new firmware sets for us. There's a couple of things to know about as far as if you're dealing with firmware to set up a structured management. Now, this is current and legacy from the beginning of the DE4000. We may be changing a little bit soon how we do our firmware, but today this is how it's done. If you are going to be flashing firmware, what you will receive is a link to download a zip file. And when you unpack that zip file, these are the files that you'll see in it. What you'll see is you'll see a file for the control board, and you'll see a file for the terminal board. Now, these two files are going to have the name of the firmware in them, in their name. So you can see that this is version 2.0.0. Okay. Likewise, if you look down at focus your attention on the bottom, you'll see the same thing, the original zip file that we unpacked, and then what we unpacked out of it. We see the control board firmware, and we see the terminal board firmware. This one happens to be version 2.1 pre-release 12. What you'll see also is on the two files is update ATF file. An update ATF file. So again, this group is for version 2.0. This is 2.1 pre-release 12. Now, you'll see something else different right off the bat. Some of you have already probably caught it, is a kernel ATF. So if we release a pack of firmware to you and there's something else additional required, we'll inform you about it. In this case, we had a kernel ATF update that was in a core base operating system that was necessary, and they were loaded twice, or both loaded at the same time. They're both ATF files, kernel ATF and an update ATF, and the instructions were to load them at the same time. This is rare. Routinely, it's only the update ATF file that's the trick, or the additional third file, if you will. Now, what that update ATF file is actually the core operating system that runs under a Linux-based system. So it's just like, say, reloading Windows on a Windows-based PC. Because of the nature and the nature of the system, and the way the computer systems see this to take it as an update, it can never have a different unique name. It always has to be update ATF. Now, the important thing to remember is if you look at the size of this file, it's 22,000 kilobytes. And if you look at the size of this one, a much later version, it's 38 kilobytes. 38,000 kilobytes. So there's something different about these two files, but they have the exact same name. So for that reason, they can't have a different name. They have to have this name. They can't have a unique name, but they are different and pertinent, and they do link up specifically to a certain version of firmware. So I could not use this update ATF file with version 2.0, and vice versa. So when you receive these, if you're going to be doing a lot of firmware, it's important to make sure that you manage how you store these files. So what you can see that I've done on my computer is I have one folder named firmware, and underneath that I have a folder for every version that's ever been released to me. And inside of it is where I house all of this information. And that keeps me from getting the update ATF files confused from one version to the next. So I just wanted to point that out. We've already had a guy or two just kind of dump every loose file in one folder, and so all of a sudden he's got 12 different update ATFs and nobody knows which one. So it's pretty much trash at that time. Delete it all out and start over. So if you're doing this again, be versed on doing a file management, setting up file folders on your computer so you can keep track of it. So let's move into how do we do the firmware update. One required item you need is our hardware kit. You might want to capture this part number here. It is available from our factory to our distributors. What it consists of is this ST-Link. It comes with a USB cable to interact with your laptop and a very special connector that's manufactured by Altronic to allow you to connect this ST-Link into both the control board, that's what we're seeing here in this image, as well as, I think I have an image later of the terminal board. If I don't, I'll produce one at a later date for you guys. So the second thing you'll need, which you can get almost anywhere, is a micro SD card. And this one happens to be a 16 gigabyte micro SD card. Any micro SD card will work for you as long as it is a maximum size of 32 gigabytes. So you don't want to try to use anything larger than 32 gigabytes. And this day and time, that's sometimes hard to find a smaller memory card like that. Also notice there's a red line on this ribbon strip where it plugs in. There's a set of 8 pins on both the control board as well as the terminal board. Always make sure that the red line, if you orientate the board, just kind of turn your head as you're looking at this screen 90 degrees to the left. If you orientate this line or this edge of the board towards you and call that the bottom, then make sure that the ribbon strip connects with the red line always to your right hand side, and you'll be fine. So let's just go through the procedure. One of the things that I do is I'm a creature of habit. Now, I'm not going to say this is the only way you can do it, but it's the way I do it. And generally what I do when I say I'm a creature of habit, I find one way that works for me, and I go with that method moving forward. I do not like to deviate from that, and it keeps me consistent. That way, if I do have a problem later in the field or in a shop or wherever I may be, even if I'm in my lab, that I know that I followed a protocol that's been working, so something else must be wrong. So the first thing I do if I'm going to start flashing the firmware on these systems is definitely we have to remove the overlayment that's over. There's usually about 7 to 8 screws. Here's a mounting location with threads for the screws, so the covers have already been removed. We remove these main covers. We do not have to remove the cover off the SOM, but some people do like to remove the cover off the SOM. They say it makes it a little easier to get that micro SD card slid into the slot. I do not currently. But we have to remove the cover, power down the panel before starting all of this. Then what I do is I come back, and I'm going to jump back a slide or two. I come back in. Every board, terminal board, has a 3-pin power strip that gives it the 24 volts to operate on. Even the control board has a 3-pin. So what I do is I disconnect all the power strips from all the boards. I don't worry about the HMI, but I don't want any of my boards powering up. Now this is me, and not all the engineers do it this way. I then attach my cable and my ST-Link, and at that time, then I power on the one board by turning on the panel and then plugging in the power connection to that one board only. We have proven cases that consistently it works out a little bit better if we follow that method. Okay, so that said, when you get your ST link, you can go to their website, the ST Link utility, and download the ST Link utility. Just like going to the Ultronic website, you can download software that you need for free. And the software looks just like this when you open it. So the first thing to do, now there's some shortcut buttons that some people will click. I've seen that. Again, I'm a creature of habit. I like to click Target. And I note that right here. I said to click Target in the software and say Connect. As soon as you connect, you should get some information down here populating that looks just like this. And then the next thing to do is to click Target and Chip Erase. Don't worry, you're not going to hurt anything. A window may pop up like this that says, hey, you're about to erase the chip, or you want to do that. And you say, okay. You'll get another message with a new population message down at the very bottom indicating that the chip is now erased. And then you'll want to click on File up here at the top, and you'll want to navigate to your folder, such as the folder structure I was showing you a few moments ago, to find the file that you want to open. So you're going to click File and Open and select the SREC file. I'm going to bounce back for reference real quick. That is an SREC file as well as this one. So notice you have one named control board, one named terminal board. So if you're plugged into a control board, you're obviously going to select the SREC file that says control board in it. But like vice versa, if you're plugged into a terminal board, you're going to select the one that says terminal board. You're going to select it and say Open. And then you're going to click Target. And then you're going to click Program and Verified. So every time you click this word Target up here, a little submenu pops up and gives you these options. Once you've selected, once you've selected Program and Verify, this will be the last little pop-up window, and you'll simply click Start. And you'll wait, and sometimes it takes it a few seconds to get going, but generally the whole process is less than 10 seconds. You'll get a green strip that runs across this, and it'll say done, and you'll get another message down here in the bottom that says program successfully, or something to that effect. Once completed, you can click Target and disconnect, and then you can power down your system. Now, if you've got multiple boards to do, one control board and say several terminal boards, simply, again, unplug the power terminal to that one board, unplug your ribbon strip from your your ST link, and repeat the process on the next board. Any questions on this? Okay, guess I was good. All right, so now that you've programmed every board with its firmware or the SREC file, the next thing you need to do is update the operating system. So again, the operating system is written specially for each firmware set. And this is the ATF file in most cases. Again, we've had a couple of cases in older firmware where there was a kernel ATF. The procedure's the same. You would install both these ATF files. Again, usually it's just the one update ATF on the micro SD card. So you would insert the micro SD card in your adapter or in your side slot. If you happen to have a newer laptop, most laptops now have a slot for a micro SD card built into them. And you would copy this ATF file onto your micro SD card. You'll then, while the power switch is off for the panel, you'll plug in every power strip to all your control board and all your terminal boards. You would insert this card right here in the slot on top of the SOM module, and you would simply power the panel up at once, like you normally would any panel. It'll take about 3 to 5 minutes for this to boot up properly. When you know it's booted up, you'll see on the HMI one of our default screens, which is just the HMI on a dashboard. You'll see one tachometer, and you'll see 4, we'll call them rainbow colored LEDs. Probably the default names are fuel, ignition, crank, and preloop. Once you've done that and see that, you can power the system off, remove the micro SD card, and you can proceed to the next step by loading up your JSON program for your particular application. Does anybody have any questions about this firmware? It sounds a little scary if you've never done it, but it's literally the easiest product that I've ever updated firmware into. Probably the hardest part is removing the little plastic covers with all the screws. I'll pause for a moment to give anybody an opportunity to ask a question if they'd like.
John, there was
John?
Go ahead. Go ahead. John, there was a question that was raised in the chat. Assume you would need to export the JSON file from the DE4000 before starting the firmware update. Want to comment on that?
That's a very good question. Absolutely. So if you're happy with your current program and you're updating the firmware for a multitude of reasons, you definitely want to get a copy of your JSON out of the system if you hadn't already done so. Now, most people always have a backup on their laptops, but we'll get into that here later in the day. But yes, that's a very good point, because once you do this whole procedure that we've just gone through, you wipe the system, and meaning what program was in there is gone. Now you've just overridden everything and wiped it clean, so it's just like a brand new DE4000 fresh out of the box, so to speak. So that's a very good question, and the answer is yes. You want to always do a backup. Now, that also brings up another thing to me. We had this happen just yesterday. I was working with one of our engineers and an engineer out in the field with one of our customers, and he's very advanced. He was writing a lot of his own script in the system. Now, if you've been around the 4000 and listened to any of us talk, you've heard about script. Well, he actually created a line error in his script code and got what we call a black screen of death. Now, there's a couple of different things that can happen and cause this black screen of death, but the only way to recover is to reload the operating system or the update ATF file. So the symptom is he's working with a unit at one point, and he forced some code into the system that was totally incorrect, and it was a typo on his end. We found it. But when the system saw that, it errored out the system, and so his HMI just went black screen. And he tried to he could ping everything, and that's another topic. We may have time for that today. I don't know. We've covered it in other classes before. He pinged everything, and he had communication, so he knew that everything was working good. But if he tried to connect through his HMI or through a laptop, he kept getting just a black screen. So the only way to recover that is, one, know what firmware you have in it before you start working with it all the time. I'll give an example of how to check what firmware you have later in today's presentation. But then if you get this black screen of death, the way to recover it is, let's say he had 2.0, you go to your 2.0 firmware folder, you get that update ATF file for that, install it on your micro SD card, and just do that one procedure. Power everything down, insert the card, power it up. It's going to wipe it. You're going to lose anything in there if you didn't have a backup, but at this point you have no choice, and it will recover the system. So that's one thing that we've seen. We don't see this very much, but when we do see it, that's the procedure. So the next thing we want to talk about is, okay, you've talked about Wi-Fi. We're going to get into that here in a little bit, but we're going to talk about doing a direct connection between your laptop and the DE4000. Now, I said earlier that whether you're connected by Wi-Fi, whether you're connected by a hard wire like an Ethernet cable, or you're at the HMI, you have the same functionality and the utilization of the system. And all three ways. If I'm putting in a new JSON program or doing some critical type manipulation of my program, I like to be hardwired. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be. Again, I'm saying that's my personal preference. I like to be hardwired. If I'm doing minor changes, such as maybe I'm just trying to get a copy of the JSON out of the panel, or which is the main program file format, or maybe I'm just tuning some things and tweaking some things while the unit's running, while the unit's down, et cetera, some minor things. That's when I really, or just using it on a day-to-day operational basis, that's when I really like to use the Wi-Fi advantage, because it frees me up to where I'm not in one place. I can be standing up on top of the cooler testing a liquid level shutdown while holding a tablet in my hand. And that makes it really nice because I'm not having to holler back at somebody at the other end of the skid of the compressor package. But one of the, and again, there's always more than one way to do everything. This is one of our preferred best ways to do it, is to use, when we're connecting to the DE4000, to use what we call a USB to Ethernet adapter. They're available anywhere, online, electronic stores, et cetera, and this is exactly what they all look like. They plug into the USB port on your computer. Most modern day computers will recognize the system automatically. You don't have to go and download special drivers and all that. But there are some setups to it. And the reason being is if you're used to doing anything Ethernet based or Wi-Fi based, let's say at your house, you buy the latest and greatest dishwasher that's Wi-Fi enabled, or your thermostat for your house. All those devices are designed for home use. And all those devices have what they call an IP address in them, but they're all designed, and those systems are designed to automatically assign things IP addresses. Now, sometimes you can get a conflict in IP addresses. So if you've ever had the system where you can't get one thing that's Wi-Fi connectivity in your house to work, but everything else does, but you go and you reset or do a power cycle on your wireless router at your house, and all of a sudden everything works, that was the deal. You had to reset the system to where everybody gets their own unique IP address, but the system gives it automatically. The 4000 does not do that. It does not do automatic IP addresses. They're fixed. And so that makes it a little bit difficult if you just take your laptop with an Ethernet cable, plug it into the Ethernet port, and plug it into the Ethernet port on the 4000. You're not necessarily going to connect to it and see what you want to see without changing your network connection port settings. Well, the problem with that is now when you take your computer and you go back into the office and you're doing your day-to-day things, you've got to go back and change your port settings again. And that can get to be a hassle. I know a lot of engineers that like to do it that way, but when we get down to the field level and all that, and we're jumping from this unit to that unit, it's not necessarily the most viable idea. So what we want to do is, if we use this USB to Ethernet adapter, we can change the port settings on this one adapter one time, and we never have to modify anything on our computer at all ever again. And as long as we're using this adapter to do our connectivity into the 4000. So it's a USB Ethernet adapter. To set one up, you'd plug it into your computer, obviously, but you'd log into your computer's control panel. So if you don't know how to do that, I'm going to just kind of do an example real quick. If I just click my start menu down the bottom and start typing, don't have to have a cursor anywhere. Just I've clicked that one button is all I've done, and I'm going to say, I just typed a C. There's control panel. Now you can move your mouse in, if you can find it. Up there it is. And click that, and control panel will open up. So you'll want to log into your computer's control panel and then go to Network and Sharing Center. And you'll want to click this button over here that says Change Adapter Setting. And then you want to identify your adapter. Now, the next screen might get a little hairy. So this is actually what my computer looked like as of about a week ago. Once I've done what I just outlined, I've got all these Ethernet adapters. Well, the first thing that I'm looking at is, okay, I'm not a computer IT guy. I'm trying to figure out, well, which Ethernet adapter is the one I want to modify. So you can see right now that I've got one named 4000. But before you give it a custom name, I couldn't tell you what it started out as. Probably Ethernet port 1 or Ethernet port 2. Well, no, there's a 2. So probably Ethernet 1 or 5. So I've got all these Ethernet connections on my computer. Don't know why. I only have one Ethernet connection on my computer, but that's what I've got. Everybody's computer is going to be a little bit different. But if you simply grab your USB to Ethernet adapter and unplug it from the computer, while you're on this screen, you'll see it disappear. And you plug it back in, you'll see it reappear. At that point, once you see it reappear, okay, that one's the one that just reappeared, you can just simply right-click on it and select from a menu and rename it. And on this one, just like you would rename any file or folder on your computer, right-click, rename. I happen to name this one 4000, so now I can identify it at any time very easily if I ever do need to come back in and make any kind of a modification. So once we've done that, right-clicking it on it again, we can go into a thing called Properties. And we want to double tap on this, Internet Protocol version 4. And I've highlighted it over here. So we want to double click on that. And yeah, we want to double click Internet Protocol version 4 TCP/IPv4. I'm sorry, I didn't spell out the whole thing. And this window will open up. And these are the default values that you want to enter in. If you enter in this default value, you will be fine. And I go on and I do it both on these lines. Some people will say this line's not too critical, but I just noticed that, hey, this is what was in mine the other day, and it works like a charm. The next, so you've just assigned a special IP address to this one adapter. Now, the default thing would have been obtain an IP address automatically. That's not what we wanted. Once you've done that, you can say OK, click out and exit, and you're good to go. Now, when you plug in your USB to Ethernet adapter and then connect from it an Ethernet cable into the correct port on the DE4000, we covered that earlier, you can simply type in this default IP address every time, and you'll end up getting to your screen. Any questions on that? Okay. So,
could you go back one more time? I wanted to write down an IP address. Could you go down? Thank you.
Yes, sir. Tell me when you got it, and we'll move on.
Got it. Thanks, John.
Yes, sir. Okay. So again, here's an image of my web browser. I use a lot of Firefox. I bounce between Firefox and Google Chrome. Most of our development engineers use Chrome, so I'm out in the field using Firefox. If we ever get a bug that doesn't work in Firefox, then we catch it that way. But once you connect, do everything we've outlined before. You connect to the system, you open up your web browser of your choice, and you type in that IP address. There it is again, 908.102.65.174, and hit enter. And this is where you would type in normally, www.ultronic-llc.com to get to a website. In this case, we just typed in the simple IP address, and we get our DE4000 connectivity back and forth. Now, on a side note, if you're working with screen, okay, if you're connected through a web browser with a laptop to the 4000, if you're doing a lot of changes, whenever you finish, let's say you make 3 or 4 changes and you're going to take a break and go check some things, get in the habit of hitting Control-R at the same time on your keyboard, and that will cause your browser to refresh. Now, this is true when you're connected to hardware. That's to help ensure that the changes that you did took effect. But another thing you need to do is go up to the unit. You can do this while it's running, doesn't hurt it. open up the panel and reach to the power strip. Again, 3-wire power strip, positive power, negative battery power supply. I'm in a case ground. Unplug it. Count to 3. Plug it back in. That reboots the HMI and forces it to update. So anything that you've changed, that's another good check to make sure those changes took effect. Another tech tip of the day, if you're in a facility where you're working on multiple units at the same time, when you get ready to move off of one unit and your next mission is to go down and plug into another unit, don't just shut down your browser, shut down the tab that you're in. Physically turn it off. An example, there, I've turned it off. Now when I go connect to the new unit, I'm opening up a brand new tab to enter in my IP address. I've had some crosstalk get carried over, things get carried over from one unit to the next that I did not want to occur that way. So that's just my tech tip tool of the day. Let's get back to that PowerPoint. There's one more thing we wanted to cover with it. Now, the third way to connect, the second way to connect and interact with this thing is using the Wi-Fi connectivity. So if you're standing at the HMI and you want to use the Wi-Fi, click Global and Network, and it's going to bring up this screen that you see right here. Now, all this information is pertinent to, let's say, maybe we're connected to a plant, a SCADA system is connected, communications for the plant is hardwired into the panel, or a telemetry system is hardwired into the panel using the Ethernet. They may have changed these settings for that device. Now, these are correct IP addresses and IP net mask and gateways for that system, the SCADA system, to communicate back into the 4000. That's fine. Leave those alone. Get in the habit of not changing those unless that's what you're there to do. But down at the bottom is the Wi-Fi setting section. Now, by default, it's not set up. It can be set up to a couple of different things. I'm going to cover the access point today only. But you'll select access point, and by default, you may come up with a SSID. So what is an SSID? It's the Wi-Fi's name. If you've traveled to travel for a living in this industry and you go to a Holiday Inn or a Marriott or whatever type of hotel and they have free Wi-Fi, you're looking for their Wi-Fi name to connect, have something to connect to. So this is a unique name that you can assign the unit. Don't get in the habit of naming them DE4000. When we had one gentleman in a plant where he had 4 units side by side and he named them all 4000. So, and he gave them all the same password too, by the way. So he had no idea which unit he was connecting to. So we got that straight. And I said, don't you have unit numbers in this plant? He says, yeah. So let's name them unit numbers. Now you can name it anything you want to. Except there might be a restriction. The system will bounce back and tell you if it does not like something on special characters. This one happens to be Unit 45 for the name. I did give it a simple password, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Password must be 8 characters minimum. And this is mainly because of Apple and iPhones, but must be 8 characters minimum. I do not recommend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for your password. I recommend it's something unique. But notice, if you log into the system, if you forget your password, it's going to be displayed right here through your HMI. Once you've set this up, you can click Save, and those effects take hold. You may need to do a power cycle on the panel. So obviously you would have to shut the unit down if it's running. You may need to do a power cycle before these changes take full effect, before you can truly connect to it. Now, one of the key ways to verify that things are working, I'll back up a few slides. More than a few. Right here. Here's your Wi-Fi antenna on the control board. Right underneath at the edge of this, where it says Wi-Fi on this cover, is a blue LED that will be lit up and illuminated if your Wi-Fi is working. So if it's not activated, it should not be lit up. Now, that's subject to change because you never know what they're going to do with firmware changes as they come right around the corner. But currently, right now, that's the case. So once you've set this up, you will follow standard protocol. You will take your computer, look for the Wi-Fi network. You'll be looking for, in this case, Unit 45. You'll connect. It'll ask you for a password. You'll enter in the password that you've set up here. And then, just like being hardwired, when you open up your browser, you'll simply go to it and enter in the correct IP address. In this case, it is a different IP address. It's whatever is written right here. Everybody captures that, so it's going to be unique every time. So don't waste your time writing this one down. Even though that may be a default number, I don't know. I changed so many things, but that's how you would connect via Wi-Fi. If you hadn't connected to a DE4000 via Wi-Fi, I strongly recommend it. You will absolutely love it. When it was originally introduced, I think in the very early 2020, if I got my year straight, way before COVID was an issue here in the States, within the first 5 minutes of having it, we were running around on the unit troubleshooting stuff with it. It was the greatest thing since sliced bread because I didn't have to go back and forth to the panel, and or I'm sitting between two 3600 units with one down that I'm on. I didn't have to create my own custom sign language back and forth to the guy standing at the panel. I had the panel in my hand, and I had full control of it while I'm out on the skid floor troubleshooting something out on the skid floor. So it's a great tool. Any questions about what we've covered so far? Any at all? Going once? Going twice?
Hey, John.
Yes, sir.
John, it's Richard.
Yes, sir.
Don't forget to mention the IP net mask there is incorrect. It's showing the IP address, and I think that's been fixed in later firmware, but you need to go ahead and blank that out and enter the proper net mask. Down below at your SSID, bottom right.
Right here, IP net mask.
That should be your 255, 255, 255.0, or whatever mask you're using.
Okay, yeah, and I think I actually got this one off of a virtual one, so more than likely I did. So yeah, that's a good point. So say that number again one more time, Richard.
What I use is the 255.255.255.0, but that's for my configuration. Yeah.
Just like this gateway up here, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good. Thank you. Anything else? Anybody?
Good job, by the way.
Thank you, sir. I always appreciate a compliment from you, sir. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just move into the software a little bit. We've got coming up on about 12 minutes left. If Dave Bell let me go over, I'll spend as much time as y'all allow me to. But I wanted to cover up a couple of key points. First, there is a newer, and I'll highlight it here in blue at the top. There is a newer virtual DE4000 website to go to. It's Altronic VMS 21.ddns.net. And I'm just going to hit the refresh button real quick and bring it up. So when you first connect to a DE4000 out in the field that has no program in it, if you recover one the way we talked about using the micro SD card, or if you first go to our website, this is what you're going to see. And I think I described it earlier. So it's an engine RPM tach. We have our rainbow colored LEDs for our DS outputs. These are the only ones that are these colors: fuel, ignition, crank, and prelude. So this is default. If we want to see what version firmware we're in, I said something about showing you that, and this is true. This is primarily true for when you're trying to connect to a unit or working with a unit out in the field. It's imperative that you know what firmware is in that panel. I could see if I was still working in the field carrying a Sharpie and writing the date and keeping a log of what firmware's in everything, because if you get that black screen of death, you really need to know what your firmware was before you got the black screen of death. But simply click the gear in the lower right-hand corner and go up to the top right-hand and say System Info. Now, I'm on a web virtual application, so this is version 2.1, pre-release 15A. Great. That said, if you're connected to hardware, you'll have several more lines. Capture all those lines. You'll have a SOM module version, you will have a control board version, and a terminal board version. Obviously, the control board and the terminal board firmware is what we covered updating. Those are the two most important dates that you'll need. When you're done, you simply close that out, and if you want to get completely out, click on your dashboard. So now, let's just assume we're connected to a live working unit and we want to load a program. So we've updated our firmware, we've recovered it using the micro SD card method, and we want to, now we're connected to it, we're seeing this screen, and we want to load our program back into it, aka our JSON file. Simply click the gear, simply click Import File. It'll take us to the last place we were working with the program. I'm going to click this one just for fun because it happens to be one I've been working on a bunch this week. And it takes a minute or two for this importing and saving configuration to complete. This is both true in the virtual world as well as when you're connected to a real DE4000. Overall, it didn't take very long, a lot quicker than a DE3000. So a couple things that have come up this week that are key on my mind that I want to show you guys is just a few little tips and points. We don't have much time, so I'm going to kind of keep this short and quick. Let's look at our suction pressure. If I select that gauge, it takes us straight to the channel. Now, I've also said, or there's multiple ways to get into the channels, and if we want to see a channel grid, we can select the first input up at the top, and it'll take us to our whole grid. If I want to go back to that suction channel, I can simply select suction. Or if I'm not sure if I'm back where I was, I can just go back to the dashboard and start over. There I am on the pertinent information for that suction. So one key thing, some of the wording and the way we interpret words can sometimes be confusing to all of us. I know my life has become a lot more confusing lately. Low gauge range and high gauge range. So I had a gentleman trying to set up a panel the other day, and in his case, he had a 4 to 20 milliamp pressure transducer. So instead of saying pressure here, he said current loop because he was doing a 4 to 20. Well, that's fine. In fact, I'll just do that. So he had a current loop for his sensor, a 4 to 20 milliamp. He had his custom units. We'll just make some up, PSIG. And everything looked pretty good. And it turned out that his pressure transducer was a 0 to 1,000 pound. And this is what he did right here. He set his low gauge range and his high gauge range. And he says, well, why isn't it working? It's not reading right. There's another step that you've got to do. Page down. So like anything that we've done, as long as we've been dealing with 4 to 20 milliamp pressure transducers, we use a 200 ohm resistor in our system, and the way we wired the system converts that 4 to 20 milliamp signal to 0.8 and a 4 volt range. So I pointed out to the gentleman, hey, here's where you want to go. Advanced settings on this next page to scale your pressure transducer. In this case, 0 to 1,000. So that is how you scale your pressure transducer. This is not. So at that point, his pressure should start reading correctly. Now, what is this for? Some people are going to ask. If we go back to our dashboard, there's our 0 to 1,000 scaling. But let's say we're operating in a window. Keep this real simple. Let's say we're operating within a really tight window. Oh, kind of got that backwards, didn't I? Old habits die hard. So now what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of red showing where our shutdown areas are at 500 and 700. So it's kind of hard. I'm going to show you another cool trick. On the virtual world, if you push test, oops, not if you do that. I'll come back to this in a minute. If our needle's running somewhere in here, well, where is it really at? Well, we got the value here, but if you're like me, you're kind of old school, you really depend on where these needles point. If you want to change the resolution of how this gauge is displayed here, that's what this area is for. And say like 400 for the low, and I can say 800 for the high. When I come back to my dashboard, you can see that my scaling range is now 400 to 800, but all of a sudden this operating area that it's going to be in between the high and the low kill has become a lot more legible. Now, that does not mean the gauge can no longer read only as low as 400 and only as high as 400. And this banner down here at the bottom, it's always going to display whatever the full true scaled range is, which in this case it's 0 to 1000. Now, let me show you something really cool about this virtual program that we have access to these days. These are things that I've learned myself just in the last couple of months, and I find them fascinating, and I'm already using them as tools as every day of my business students. You'll notice I put it into test mode, and we've talked about test mode in other videos and how we go into the values and we would select the channel that we want to, maybe we select the channel that we want to test, and then we can go test that in device. Okay. But in the virtual world, test mode does something totally different. It allows us, think of us have a way of having a virtual simulation potentiometer to change the value. So I'm setting this up in a virtual world to work and test things in a lab as a development tool. And I don't have the capabilities to wire in a 0 to 5 volt pot to actually hardwire in the simulation to change this value. But in test mode, I can select the gauge. Notice it didn't take me into the channel section this time. It pops this menu up. Now, the one key thing is now I've got this 16.08, this long infinity number. Let's say if I just change it to 560 and say set, it's going to bounce to 560 if you caught that quick enough for a split second and go right back down to the default place where it began. Notice 16.1, 16.0, it's this default value. I'm going to show you how to fix that. I'm going to go into global, and I'm going to go into scripts. Don't get scared if you're not a programmer, neither am I. Click on demo script and put 2 minus symbols, right behind this 1, and click save. Now that can stay there forever. It's not going to hurt anything. Even if you develop your program and you forget and you leave that in there, it's not going to hurt anything once you take it out into the real world and plug it into a unit. The demo script doesn't run when you're plugged in and have this JSON file loaded into a real working unit. Now I'm still in test mode. I'm going to click back on the suction gauge. Yeah, that 16.4 infinity value shows up, but now if I go 560 and hit set, changes that reading to 560 and stays put. So now if I want to, with using this virtual online tool, if I'm sitting in a hotel, sitting in a trade show, sitting in my office and don't have access to hardware, but I've got to test somebody's program, I can actually test it. So let me show you the rest of the story. I can come into values and select discretes, and I can come up and select, I've obviously got all these channels discrete channels, scrubber liquid level, oil level, so on and so forth that are all faulted. Well, before what I would have to do is I had to actually disable those channels, but then I didn't have a full working program. So what I can do now is I can simply change the stat from 0 to 1 and get it out of a fault. Now it's not going to change on my screen, so I just have to know that. But I can run through this real quick. and just make sure I hit all the ones that are showing faulted. There's the last one. Go back to my dashboard. Now I should be able to hit reset with no faults. Perfect. So if I want to start it up, I can. So it goes into a warning state and a preloop state. On this particular one, the first thing it's looking for is a permissive. Permissive A, I happen to know what permissive A is in the preloop state is the oil pressure has to be above 10 pounds. So I can click 55 because that's where I want it operating at anyway. While I'm waiting for the preloop to finish, I can go on and give it some oil temperature, 180. Maybe compressor vibration, I can give it a 0.5. All those, I happen to know that this one's a little bit tricky. I don't know where the kill's set at on it. I'm going to give it a 0.3 and see if it'll stay running there. The valve state. So this one actually has some valve automation on it. We're still waiting for the preloop cycle to finish, so I can jump back up. I'm going to exit and re-enter my test mode to reset my clock. It should refresh in a minute. I've got two input channels for my bypass valve position. I'm just going to change this first one to 1 and the last one for blowdown to a 1. And I should get some, yeah. So the blowdown should be closed. It is. The bypass valve should be opened. It is now. And I'm waiting for crank weight, so I obviously have to give it some RPM. Running through the rest of it. Okay, so now it's in warm-up. So once my warm-up timer times out, and I think it's about a 2-minute timer, it'll advance into running state, and I can do additional testing. But that is a quick, down dirty crash course on how you can use this online virtual tool to actually run simulations. And I just caught something else. I should probably get these where they won't fault once those C timers expire. Yeah, if I did everything right, this unit should stay running all night once it goes into running mode. So I see we're out of time. We've reached our hour. I'll open the floor up to any questions that anybody has and then hand the floor back over to David Bell.
John, one of the questions came up here on the chat was the web link. Apparently on the Ultronic website, I've looked at that here and I'm not specifically finding it here. So, Mr. Burns, can you tell me what reference you raised there here? What specific document or location needs to be revised? Because he says that it's not matching the one that you've just shown.
Yeah. So under the instruments and controls on the Ultronic website under products, if you go to the virtual web-based application link under controllers for the DE4000, it takes you to the 2 different websites ago. So it's like version 1.
What was the manual reference again? So
if you go Ultronic, then products, then controllers.
Yep.
Down near the bottom of that scroll down, you'll see virtual web-based application DE4000. If you click on that link,
gotcha.
It'll take you.
Okay.
I've shown it to customers and stuff, but I often provide them with the link to the new one because that one isn't.
We'll get that updated. I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same one, so we'll get that up. Thank you very much.
I think this is the document right here.
Yep. So, John, would you mind sending a note to Brian with a copy to Chuck Cooper and ask him to provide the corrected link or the correct whatever we would need to change? It looks like the names are the same. So
there are
Ultronic VMS 21.ddns.net. So that would need to be reflected into that link, correct?
Right.
Yep.
And there are several of these virtual online platforms. And I mean, we started this virtual online platform. We were in version 1.2. I can't remember that far back, but and then we had one for 2.0, and then there are about 4 of them, and they're all different and unique. This happens to be the newest one. When I pulled up the firmware on this was actually 2.1 pre-release 15A. So this is actually only about 3 weeks old.
Okay.
Right now. This is brand new. And
Okay.
that's why I thought, and since it's become available, I'm using it almost every day.
No, that's good.
And it's going to change again with the new releases.
Yep.
So let's do this. Probably what we need to do is wait till 2.1 is released.
Then we'll do it coincident with this.
Yes.
Yep, that works. Blake, thanks for bringing that to our attention, sir.
Sure thing.
Any other questions?
Other questions for Mr. Nance? As usual, John, well done. Exhaustive review. Yeah, an exhaustive review. Anything for John? We've got him on the line.
Any idea when the 2.1 will be released?
It will be. It'll be sometime after Labor Day. We are getting very close. The biggest issue is we're trying to put the bootloader in there, so we're not having to do a second release right after the 2.1. So that's pretty much going to be the thing that's going to be focused on up to the holiday. So you should know sometime after the Labor Day we'll have a big message when it is formally released.
We'll do a formal release on that, Ken, with the distributor call and release notes and the whole works, so that everybody can get up to speed on it.
Dave or Greg, do either one of y'all want to share a little bit about since Greg brought it up, what the bootloader is?
Fire away, John.
Yeah,
okay.
I can.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Greg. Yeah.
So, the whole issue, and just to let you know, your tools are going to be needed for those that are out in the field. So, but what the bootloader is going to basically help us do is allow us to basically load firmware after 2.1 with the USB, so that you won't have to have the ST-Link and any of these special tools. But remember, we've got several of these units out in the field. You will need to do the ST-Link up to 2.1 before you can use the bootloader. So the bootloader will only be effective from 2.1 and later from that firmware revision. So it's going to make our life a lot easier. If you were on the release on the AFR 500, we've already done it on that device. And so what we're going to do is basically take that same capability that we have on the AFR 500 and make that done the same way, moving on from 2.1.
Greg, I put up on the screen that I'm sharing. Is this the USB port that the
Yes.
thumb drive would insert into?
That's correct.
So it's going to become as easy as updating. If you ever bought a Blu-ray player like me and you bring it home, and at the same time you buy this, newest release movie, and you got a brand new Blu-ray player, and all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, my Blu-ray player won't play this Blu-ray, and you all of a sudden start reading the directions and say, oh, it was shipped with the latest and greatest firmware, but you may need to update it. So you follow their directions, you insert from their website a program file on your USB, and you go and stab it in and follow their on-screen directions, and it updates the firmware on the Blu-ray player. Kind of a flawless one-step move. That's Greg, if I'm interpreting everything right, that's what they're saying. It's going to be as easy to do with the 4000 down the road.
That's correct. You'll be given the latest file, and you just put it in there and follow the instructions.
That'll be very nice.
Yeah, that's a significant increase in terms of flexibility and being able to always push the latest functionality to this device. And as Greg said, we've already rolled that out on the AFR 500. So, this is a major step forward. But certainly, we made the ST-Link kits available here earlier this year. There was a distributor bulletin that was sent out. There's pricing set, kit number, the whole works. So certainly make sure that you have that in your toolbox here, and your service folks have that in their toolboxes to manage these legacy systems that are pre 2.0 are currently running it with a pre 2.1 firmware set. But certainly all new production going forward here then would update in this very convenient, slick way here with no external tooling required. So that's a big step forward for us here. So that'll be a very comprehensive release here lots of new networking updates and so on here. But in addition to the bootloader that Greg has just described, so as I said, there'll probably be a call sometime in September, just like this one here, that we'll announce, just like we released the AFR 500 yesterday, where we'll put Brian on the phone, Greg will be on the phone, Andrew, John, the whole group, and we'll go over all the release notes associated with this, all the functionality changes and so on, just so everybody is up to speed on exactly what new capabilities are available in this 2.1 push. Oh, Greg, anything else from your side on this, or John?
Maybe what I'll put, since we got the big group here, is
sure.
Here in the next week or two, the biggest thing you'll see with this 2.1 is this the latency issue with the HMI. We're about to have a release here in the next few days that will basically help that until we get the 2.1 out. So if you have a customer or an issue with the latency that you need to fix, check back with us in the next, probably at the end of next week, or probably even a few days after that. We will probably have a solution for that going forward until we can get this 2.1 out. John, isn't that what PR16 will have that solution in that, correct?
Actually, 15A has it, but
we want to wait till 16 from this point forward.
Right.
Correct. It'll be the first. I guess we could say beta firmware that's been openly released. That fixes the latency issue, but yeah, it does, and it makes a big difference. Trust me.